On page 90,000 of the newspaper, a tiny little article about this bill, and I took it and I drew up my own little petition for modified abortion laws. And I went then to the public, one at a time, to find anyone who would talk about it.
Pat was an early advocate of women's rights. She became a medical technologist in a San Francisco hospital where she saw hundreds of women admitted with complications from back alley abortions.
Do you approve of abortions for any reason whatsoever?
Some 100,000 women every year, this is California women alone, subject themselves to improperly or illegal abortions. I think that in itself is a rather staggering figure, and I feel great indignation as a woman to think that women have to subject themselves to second-rate medical care for a safe surgical procedure.
Information about the medical consequences of illegal abortions began to reach more legislators, and a second California assemblyman considered proposing reform.
As I traveled up and down the state, women would come up to me after my talks and tell me about their own personal involvement in abortion. That either they themselves had had one at one time or another, always of course an illegal one, or their sister had, or their mother had, or their grandmother had, or their college roommate had, but everyone knew of some other woman, if not herself, who had suffered through an illegal abortion. Which meant that of the many hundreds of thousands, perhaps so many as 1 million American women who were each year having abortions, every single one of them was a criminal. Every single one of them was a potential felon. It was this immense issue out there waiting to be resolved in some better way than we'd succeeded up till that time in doing it. But until that time, people hadn't even been talking about it.
In 1963, Bielenson took a political risk by introducing a bill that would make abortion legal in cases of rape, incest, and danger to a woman's life. The proposal failed, but interest was beginning to grow. Meanwhile, Pat McGinnis' grassroots efforts continued. She was distributing flyers to attendees of a California medical conference when Lana Phelan passed by.
It was raining, and so I ran across the street to get to my car. And there was a woman standing on the center aisle. And as I passed, she gave me a leaflet. It said, "Repeal abortion laws." And I looked at that and said to my husband, my God, the only person there with a dab of sense was standing outside in the rain.
Lana was a young housewife and mother concerned about women's health issues. She called the number on the flyer to see if she could help.
One day, not too long after that, she called me and asked me, would I go to the college and give a speech for them? They needed a speaker. And I said, what will I say? And she said, you'll think of something. And I did.
Lana talked about the trauma of her own illegal abortion at 17. She joined with Pat and another woman, Rowena Gerner, to speak out about the laws. Working out of a tiny San Francisco apartment, they launched their fledgling organization, the Society for Humane Abortion. In 1963 was a year when new dreams were born and others died. But the vision of a more humane America continued and inspired social action across the country. Pastor James Lawson, a colleague of Martin Luther King, recalls those times.
One of the mistaken notions about the 60s, I think, is the notion that we were primarily a civil rights movement. The better term for what we talked about and said would have been human rights, because we talked all the time about dignity and freedom and justice.
In the early 1960s, people began to examine the morality of many issues, including abortion. Between 1963 and 1965, an epidemic of German measles accounted for a significant rise in serious birth defects. This situation led to a greater public acceptance for abortions. But the most compelling motivation for someone to act was still a personal experience.
I had seen someone die in the military, the wife of a pilot that I was very close to. He'd come back home after World War II, only to have, within the first year of his return, his wife die as a result of a botched abortion. This background demanded that I take some action when I had the opportunity.
In spring of 1965, despite opposition in his district, Sutton introduced the first proposal for abortion reform in the state of New York.
A number of ministers who supported me on all other things opposed me on the issue of abortion reform. As a matter of fact, there were some who threatened me that they would work against my next election if I pursued the issue of abortion. That's just reform.
The bill was defeated, but early legislative efforts encouraged others around the country to speak out. In Minnesota, a respected gynecologist was appalled by the number of women she saw admitted to the hospital following botched abortions.
I gradually began to think, well, this is horrible medicine that we're practicing. This isn't the way I was taught in public health classes in medical school, that we should be able to do something about this.
Dr. Hodgson testified before legislative committees and also spoke at conferences in an attempt to reach other doctors.
The real moral and medical question is whether women should have abortions humanely and safely in our hospitals, or whether we should continue our degrading system of unwanted pregnancies and criminal abortions. I'm tired of having half the world tell the other half what they should do with their own bodies.
The hypocrisy got to me. Well-to-do women always could have them. They would go to England or Canada or wherever. They could go and get. They could arrange it, but it was absolutely impossible for the young and the poor.
Dr. Hodgson's testimony failed to sway the Minnesota legislature, but she was not deterred. Several years later, she would openly defy the law. Early in 1967, a second reform bill was proposed in New York. A group of ministers and rabbis, organized by Reverend Howard Moody, were closely watching its progress.
They didn't change that law in '67. We were meeting at the time and beginning to see what are we going to do as a result. And some of us felt very strongly and said, I think we ought to break the law. I think we ought to counsel women and help women get abortions, even if it's against the law.
With a group of 21 clergy, Reverend Moody organized a free referral network to provide counsel for any woman with an unintended pregnancy.
I felt that I could make a case to be there for her, whatever her decision was, not just if it were for abortion, but if it were having the child and giving it up, or if it were for having the child and not giving it up and keeping it. Whatever it was, we would try to help her find a way to do that. And that as religious people, as people who cared about people's spirits, there was no way that you could do that without caring about their bodies.
The clergy leadership was outspoken with their plans, but they operated covertly to avoid arrest. Arlene Carmen worked with Reverend Moody to coordinate the overall effort.
The way in which the clergy service was set up was a very protective one. I was the only person who had contact with the abortionists. The clergy never did. Someone had to go and pretend to be pregnant and go through everything but the abortion to see how the doctor treated women, because there were so many terrible stories that we heard from women about their illegal abortions.
Hospitals sometimes permitted abortions for extreme cases. In practice, these so-called therapeutic abortions were often available only to the wealthy. Arlene remembers a welfare mother whose 11-year-old daughter had been raped by a babysitter.
Everywhere she turned, she was refused, but what had enraged her the most is that in one of the interviews, her daughter was asked why she didn't want to be a mother. You're talking to a 10 and 11-year-old kid. What we did in working with a couple of sympathetic doctors was we would save our ability to get a therapeutic abortion for a situation like that.